Hi, I'm Tomy. For years, I've been helping students understand economics. And today, we're going to dive into one of the most incredible stories in modern economic history, India's Great Gamble in 1991. It's a real tale of crisis, of radical change, and of a nation betting everything on a totally new path.
So let's start with a big question. What really happens when a country with almost 1 billion people is about to go completely broke? It's a scary thought, right? A country that can't pay its bills, can't even buy the most essential stuff from abroad, and is just teetering on the edge of a total meltdown.
Well, back in 1991, India came dangerously close to finding out exactly what that feels like. We're talking about a nation with such a deep history, so much potential, just staring into an economic abyss. And this wasn't just some downturn or a recession. No, this was a full-on, code-red crisis that forced the country to rethink everything about its economy.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at just how bad things got, the brink of collapse. Then, we'll talk about the wild gamble they took. After that, we'll see how they unleashed the economy and opened it up to the world. And finally, we'll do a sort of scorecard. What worked, what didn't, and look at where things stand today. Sound good? Let's get into it.
All right, Section 1, the brink of collapse. To really get what happened next, you first have to understand just how dire the situation was. It's like they say, you can't appreciate the cure until you know how bad the disease is. And believe me, by 1991, India's economy was on life support.
So get this number right here, it tells you everything you need to know about the emergency. India had less than 2 weeks' worth of foreign money, foreign exchange reserves, left in the bank. That's enough to pay for essential imports, like oil, for just a couple of weeks. After that, nothing. The tank was, and I mean this literally, running on empty. So you're probably wondering, how on earth did it get this bad? Well, it was a perfect storm, really. For years, the country was buying way more from the world than it was selling, creating this massive gap. On top of that, the government was spending money like there was no tomorrow, borrowing heavily to make up the difference. Prices for everyday things were skyrocketing, and just, the way the economy was being managed just wasn't working. The money just wasn't coming in fast enough. With its back against the wall, India had no choice. It had to go, cap in hand, to the big international lenders, the World Bank and the IMF, and ask for an emergency loan. We're talking $7 billion just to keep the lights on. But here's the catch. That money wasn't free. It came with some very big strings attached. And those strings are what led to our next section, the radical gamble. This wasn't just a minor tweak. This was a complete 180-degree turn, a huge, risky bet that would completely change India's future. It all rested on 3 big ideas, 3 pillars. Okay, pillar number 1, liberalisation. What does that mean? Basically, it means cutting all the red tape. For decades, if you wanted to do anything in business in India, you were tangled up in a crazy web of government rules and permissions. Liberalisation was all about just setting the economy free. Pillar number 2, privatization. This one's pretty straightforward. It's about taking companies that the government owned and selling them off, putting them in private hands. The thinking was, hey, maybe private businesses can run these things better, more efficiently than we can.
And finally, pillar 3, globalization. This was the big one. It was about throwing open India's doors to the rest of the world, welcoming in foreign companies, foreign money, new technology. It was a massive shift from trying to do everything on their own to becoming a real player on the world stage. So you've got liberalization, privatization, and globalization, the whole shebang. Now let's see what that actually looked like in practice.
All right, let's zoom in on that first pillar. How did they actually go about unleashing the economy through liberalization? Well, the changes were fast and they were massive. And this right here, this was probably the single biggest change. Before 1991, India was stuck in what people called the license Raj. It was insane. You wanted to start a company? You needed a license. Wanted to make more of your product? You needed a license. Wanted to change the product slightly? You guessed it, another license. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. And the 1991 reforms, they basically took a bulldozer to that system pretty much overnight. But they didn't stop there. Oh no, the whole financial world was shaken up. The central bank, the RBI, changed its role from being a strict cop to more of a facilitator. Taxes were slashed for both people and companies to get them to save and invest more. They even devalued their currency, the rupee, to make Indian goods cheaper for the rest of the world to buy. And they started tearing down the walls that had kept foreign products out.
Okay, so what about those other two pillars? How did privatization and globalization actually play out in the real world?
Well, for privatization, the main strategy was something called disinvestment. It's a fancy word, but all it means is that the government started selling off pieces of the companies it owned. They'd identify a public company, sell some of its shares to private investors, and boom. The idea was to bring in fresh cash and new management to make these companies better and, also to get some much-needed money for the government's own pockets.
And globalization? The biggest, most obvious result of that was the explosion in outsourcing. All of a sudden, India became the world's back office. Why? Well, you had this huge pool of smart, educated, English-speaking people who could do the job for a fraction of the cost. So companies all over the world started hiring Indian firms to handle their IT, their call centers, their record keeping, you name it. This created millions and millions of new jobs.
Okay, so fast forward a few decades. The dust has settled. What's the final score? Was this whole massive experiment a success? Let's take a look at the scorecard.
I mean, just look at the raw numbers. They're pretty incredible. Take GDP growth. Before 1991, the economy was growing at about 5.6% a year. Not bad, but not amazing. But after the reforms, wow. The growth rate just took off, even hitting over 8% in the late 2000s. The whole economy was just supercharged.
And hey, remember that whole less than 2 weeks of money left crisis? Well, check this out. From a scary low $6 billion in the bank back then to over $400 billion by 2019. I mean, that is an unbelievable turnaround. India went from being on the verge of bankruptcy to having one of the biggest rainy day funds on the planet.
But, and this is a really big but, was all this incredible growth felt by everybody? See, the big shiny numbers are great, but they don't always tell you the full story. And the truth is that these changes created a lot of winners, but they also created some losers.
If you look at agriculture, for instance, where millions and millions of people work, growth actually slowed down. The government wasn't investing as much, and suddenly farmers had to compete with cheap food from other countries. The same thing happened in industry. And maybe most importantly, all that amazing GDP growth, it didn't create enough new jobs for everyone, and a lot of people argue that it just made the rich richer, widening that gap between the haves and the have-nots. Which brings us to our final section, because the story of 1991 is, well, it's complicated. It truly was a revolution, but it's a revolution that's still playing out today.
And this quote here really gets to the heart of the whole debate. You have one side saying that globalization was this incredible opportunity for India to shine on the world stage. But then you have critics who argue, hang on, this was just a way for rich countries to sell their stuff to us. Was it a golden opportunity, or was it a bit of a trap? The truth, as it usually is probably somewhere in between.
So let's wrap this up. There is no doubt that the 1991 reforms saved India from a total economic collapse and set it on a path to becoming a global powerhouse. But they also left some really tough questions on the table. Questions about jobs, about fairness, and about what kind of country India wants to be. Which leaves us with the big question. 3 decades later, is the revolution over, or is the next chapter still waiting to be written? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'm Tomy BC, and I really hope this teaching aid was helpful.